Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Hi, I am Roberto Mazza, and this is Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. My guest today is Professor Dana El Kurd. Dana is currently an assistant professor of political science at the University of Richmond, and she is the author of Polarized and Demobilized, Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine, published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. With Dana, we have engaged in a conversation about current politics of Palestine and the US related to Palestine. Hard to predict the future, but it's important to analyze what has been in order to get a sense of the roads ahead. But first things first, Dana, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, to start our conversation, you're a professor of political science at the University of Richmond in Virginia. There's also a Richmond in the UK, so I just want to clarify that division. Can you tell us what did prompt you to become a scholar, first of all, and work on the Middle East and in particular on Palestine?
Yeah, I always kind of joke that it was kind of predetermined. So I was born in Jerusalem, and I experienced particular events in my childhood and in my formative years that predisposed me to wanting to specialize in political science at the undergraduate level. So I went in knowing I was going to do political science. And then I got a double degree in political science and economics. But I didn't know exactly. That was basically because I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand why the circumstances were as they were, why my family had gone through particular things. But then when I got to undergrad, the Arab Spring happened. And I was very interested in the kind of background and context to the Arab Spring. I did some very basic undergraduate research, but that put me on the path to kind of having a fascination with and wanting to engage with knowledge production. And so then I went on to graduate school, got a PhD in political science, and just straight through. I had no other deviations from that path. I specialized in the Middle East and in particular in Palestine because I see the Palestinian question as integral to the issues of the region. And I wanted to understand Palestine not separate from, as a kind of its own entity, but as part and parcel of the broader region and some of the other issues that plague the region, including authoritarianism. So that's why.
Just a quick question about Jerusalem. You said you were born there, and I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about your memories of Jerusalem.
So I was born early 90s. And my memories of Jerusalem, because the families there and things like that were largely warm and positive, but I also, experienced the constant checkpoints, the altercations between, the Shabab and the soldiers. Going to school was an ordeal. I went to the Rosary Sister School. And it was sometimes, an ordeal for me. I also had this very interesting experience as a child in Jerusalem because my father was studying in Japan. And so I would go back and forth to Japan and see normal life for other children, and then have that contrast be very, very stark when I went back home to Jerusalem. And then I experienced part of the Second Intifada. At the time, I was staying with my maternal grandmother in Abu Dis, and the Second Intifada was quite harsh. So those are my memories of Jerusalem. Of course, I went back and forth after that, after we immigrated to the United States. So I continued to kind of see Jerusalem over time, but the Jerusalem today is very different from my memories, and has become a much more. I mean, it was already a pretty, I think, violent and uncomfortable place for Palestinians, but now has become much more suppressed.
So, before getting into our conversation about current events and politics, I would like to ask you briefly to talk about your book, Polarized and Demobilized: Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine, as an assessment of growing authoritarianism among Palestinian elites, with the effect to divest, as you say, Palestinians of political power.
Yeah, so the book is a political science book. It's intended to address the case, but also, make a theoretical contribution to the political science literature on the impacts, the legacies of authoritarianism. And I identify the dynamics. Of course, I'm not the first person to identify the dynamics following Oslo, but I identify and concur with others who looked at the Oslo framework as inherently problematic, that it created particular dynamics, which was in a large way successful in demobilizing Palestinians. So the question I ask in the book is, how did this society, the Palestinians in the occupied territories, in particular, and in Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza, how did this society that was able to engage in mass mobilization and had a very robust and thriving civil society prior to the Oslo Accords, what were the mechanisms by which those things went away? How did this group of people no longer be able to challenge Israeli state power in a way that was meaningful? And so I look at essentially the impact of Oslo, which I, talk about in the book, and others have talked about as having, essentially Oslo having created undemocratic dynamics within Palestinian politics, and made civil society less able to address political power, whether Israeli or Palestinian. And then how that then bleeds into the ability of Palestinians to protest, the ability of Palestinians to mobilize on the ground, and how it impacted polarization in Palestinian politics. So kind of, it's not just the kind of mechanisms by which this particular moment led to difficulties or obstacles in protesting, but also had kind of longer term structural impacts on how people thought and how people viewed each other, and were able to work together to address challenges. Which, I mean, the implications of my book were that, okay, well, since that this is the dynamic, it's become stagnant, and Palestinians aren't able to do X, Y, and Z, we're going to see particular outcomes. We're going to see less coordinated efforts to address Israeli power. And that means, given what we know of the literature on conflict, that means we're going to see more violence, and we're going to see more politics taking that kind of route. And so that's the book's final conclusion.
And I want to pick up on something because, as an historian of late Ottoman, particularly of the early British Mandate, obviously one of the sort of criticisms always towards the Palestinian political spectrum of that era is that it was extremely divided, and the infighting between the various factions eventually led to lack of unity and possibly lack of a unified response to the British and the Zionists. Do you think there's still a long-term legacy, or that eventually kind of disappeared?
So I'm not a historian. I don't know how much of those kinds of legacies kind of persisted in the modern era. The book looks at the 80s and the impact of, the Oslo Accords and after. I would say that 1948 was a big break kind of in Palestinian politics. Of course, Palestinian politics, remained in some particular ways divided, but I think the kind of the locus of discussion shifted away from some of those earlier divisions. We just found other divisions, but they shifted away. I think I don't know that it was a straight through from that time period to the modern era. But we do see, despite the divisions and all of the different factions in the PLO and things like this, we do see the Palestinians able to, surmount some of those obstacles, the geographic and political fragmentation, and mount a pretty successful mass mobilization during the First Intifada. So it's not that it was, all societies have particular divisions, and all societies have different ideological spectrums, but we did see a different outcome in the past, and now we're seeing a very different dynamic, and that's kind of what the book was trying to highlight.
Yeah, and I just want to remind something that I often remind listeners or colleagues and students, that explaining also the problematic nature of the geography of Palestine, how politics is hard. When I was working in Ireland at the University of Limerick, I had a few Palestinian students. And what was interesting is that I had a woman from Gaza, a woman from Bethlehem, another woman from East Jerusalem, and a guy from just a small village outside Ramallah. And what was interesting working with them was exactly like to put together the geography and the lack of communication, and obviously also the different political views and different political needs of each constituents, because obviously they lived in different situations. And I think this is something that often, I'm going to use this word, Westerners, and probably should say we, in America or in Europe, we don't really understand fully, and we just see divisions as divisions, but there's also a practical reality for that political divide. I don't know if you have similar ideas about it.
And I mean, people's political views and people's political interests stem from their material realities, right? And so, like you said, it's not unreasonable that a Palestinian in Gaza is going to have somewhat different interests right now, or even before October 7th, but definitely different interests now than a Palestinian in the West Bank, a Palestinian in Jerusalem. They have different privileges. They have, different engagement with the Israeli authorities. And that's really what Oslo cemented. Oslo, there was always this kind of geographic fragmentation as a result of the Palestinians, a large chunk of them being expelled, and the ongoing displacements even after 1967. So there was always going to be that kind of variation. And there's this large Palestinian diaspora outside as well that has a stake in that conversation. But Oslo made that, a matter of institution and policy. And then it became very difficult then to unite Palestinians on some, shared platform vis-a-vis the Israelis, because they don't have, the same relationship to the Israeli occupation. And I think that that's very valid. And that's part of, the geographic fragmentation is part of why we see the divisions that we saw up to October 7th. And even after, to be honest with you, when we look at the Palestinian polling, for example, we see variation between what Palestinians in Gaza are saying and what they want, and what Palestinians in other places are saying. But it's not just geography, I would say. There was also something fundamental about the way in which Oslo was, empowered Palestinian political elites, especially after the Second Intifada, made them very undemocratic, and there was this kind of lack of accountability generally that also shifted politics. So geography is one component, but yeah, of course, political interests vary, and that's why people have those different experiences. Yeah.
And since we're talking about the current timeline, I want really to ask about, whether the war have changed somehow your assessment about the growing authoritarianism in Palestinian politics, or what kind of changes the war, looking at your assessment for the book, may have changed.
I think that what we're seeing in the aftermath of October 7th and the war on Gaza, I, I feel kind of weird saying this, but it vindicates some of the conclusions of the book, which is what we're seeing after the war on Gaza is a Palestinian Authority that cannot rise to the occasion in any shape or form, Fatah and Hamas that cannot seem to address this division, and frankly, like, I mean, it becomes clear whether it's their trip to China or whatever that they don't actually have an interest in resolving this division, um, and the complete inability of Palestinians in other parts of historic Palestine to address what's happening in Gaza effectively. I'm not suggesting, like, I'm not blaming them, but the fact that we haven't seen mass mobilization in response to what's happening in Gaza, and the Israeli state authorities have been able to so thoroughly repress, and then our political leadership has completely lost the plot, and there is this vacuum in political leadership because the actors that exist don't have legitimacy. Like, all of this, I think, vindicates that dynamic that I describe in the book. And what I test in the book is, its impact on protest, its impact on public opinion, but those are the implications. Like, what we're seeing now is the implications. The fact that before October 7th, the kind of politics we saw in the West Bank are these militia groups that were emerging in places like Nablus and Jenin, basically confirms what I was saying in the book, that, like, we're not going to see this kind of politics. We're going to see a different kind of politics. We're not going to see protests. We're going to see something else. That's what we were saying before October 7th. Of course, nobody could have predicted October 7th, I think, in its scope or in its form. But I think a lot, not just me, but a lot of people predicted, more violent engagement with the Israeli authorities. And the complete inability of Palestinian political actors to address the moment, I think, speaks to the conclusions of the book. And then we see, these initiatives like the Palestinian National Conference and things like that are attempting to, get beyond this binary between Fatah and Hamas and try to address the larger Palestinian people and all of their aspirations, including in the diaspora. But it's still an uphill battle. And of course, the fact that the international community does not engage with those initiatives in any serious way. So, yeah, short answer, I think what we're seeing is it kind of confirms some of the stuff I found in my book.
Well, let me ask, one wonders whether this is the byproduct of events, context, choices made by individuals, or perhaps one can also consider the extent to which Israel and Israeli politicians may have pushed towards that results. I mean, the question is whether Israelis are interested through Oslo to create the conditions for a depoliticization of Palestinians so that they could make, their advances, particularly in terms of the settlements, easier in a sense.
Yeah, so the dynamics I've described, and especially on the Palestinian politics side of the question, I don't mean to suggest they're completely, completely ones of choice. And of course, Palestinian political actors also have agency, and there were kind of multiple moments in the last 30 years in which Palestinian political actors could have pursued something different. But of course, the fact of the matter is, like, when I talk about the Oslo framework, I'm talking about the kind of the intentionality of the Israelis and the United States as kind of the guarantor of the entire operation to create the dynamics we're seeing. I don't think the Israelis wanted those dynamics of division. They never intended for the Palestinians to have a state. I think that's very clear. Even in some of the speeches and some of the discourse, at that time, they may have envisioned pockets of self-governance in exactly in the way that we saw play out in the West Bank in particular. What, of course, they couldn't have accounted for something like a violent equilibrium in Gaza and with Hamas, or maybe they couldn't have accounted for the continued rise of militias in the West Bank. But I think that was the intention, was to create variations in the Palestinian experience and segment the Palestinian question. So negotiations became about Palestinians in these bits and pieces of the occupied territories, rather than the Palestinian statehood question, the Palestinian sovereignty question that is the full aspiration of the Palestinian people, whether they're in Jerusalem or within the Green Line or in the diaspora or whatever. So yeah, I'm not trying to take away the blame here from the Israeli side and the international community side. Absolutely, I think this is a trap in some ways that the Palestinians fell into. But of course, we can't excuse their role in it either.
So let me jump ahead and let's talk about Gaza. A year ago, I remember listening to a conversation you had with Dov Waxman. And I remember you were talking about the question of who should govern Gaza once the war would have been over. Now, the war is not yet over, and we don't know when that may occur. Now, we know that some Israeli parties and individuals, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, Daniela Weiss, these are well-known figures and characters. They all aim at leading Israeli settlers back to Gaza. And I must admit that to my surprise, I recently read that the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is actually opposing this idea. So in light of all of the changes occurred in the past year, a US administration, obviously, Trump is going to take power in just a few weeks. Who should, in your view, realistically govern Gaza?
So who should is going to contradict with realistically. I mean, realistically speaking, we have a Trump administration coming to power. We have a very, very, fascistic government in Israel, with, as you said, very significant elements that want to resettle Gaza, resettle, parts of Syria that they've recently taken, like Lebanon. I mean, they're expansionists. They're that kind of extremist. We may, what we may see in Gaza is a continued attempt to empty out large parts of Gaza. That's what we're seeing in the north. Realistically, we're going to continue to see that kind of violence against the Palestinian people. Now, who should govern Gaza if that violence were to end? The should is a different question. I think it can only be sustainable, even in the medium term, for an actor to emerge that can govern Gaza kind of in the short to medium term, dealing with humanitarian questions and reconstruction questions. It can only be some actor that the Palestinian people in Gaza see as legitimate. So there was this idea that was put forward, I think, a couple weeks ago, maybe a week and a half ago, called the Community Support Committee, which was, an idea established by or agreed upon by Fatah and Hamas during meetings in Cairo. An attempt that this kind of technocratic committee would manage post-war governance and reconstruction in the Gaza Strip, and it would have people from both parties. It would have people from supposedly legitimate from both parties that could govern Gaza in the short to medium term. It can only work that way. In the longer term, when we're talking about how, beyond just these humanitarian and reconstruction questions, what do we do with Gaza and the West Bank, and how do we move forward? I mean, again, what should happen is going to be different, I think, from realistically what's going to happen under the Trump administration. I think the Trump administration is going to move forward with Arab-Israeli normalization deals, with a lot of hoopla and a lot of fanfare around bringing peace and calling certain arrangements peace, quote unquote, that are actually quite violent and maintain the status quo. And they're going to claim that, whatever, little pockets of self-governance that they're going to offer the Palestinians is their form of peace. And integrate the Israeli state into their kind of regional authoritarian order more broadly, and claim that that is a quote unquote peace. That's what realistically is going to happen. What should happen is something different. But yeah.
Yeah, the should is at this point wishful thinking more than anything else. So I want to bring our conversation to our side of the ocean. And we saw that President-elect Trump has named Mike Huckabee as the next American ambassador to Israel. He's a Christian Zionist who in the past denied the existence of the Palestinian people, and he refused to call Israeli presence in the West Bank as occupation, and as well as people and the settlers to call them with that name, settlers. So I would like to hear your thoughts about this appointment.
I mean, as with everything related to the Trump administration, you can't keep up with the horror show of what's happening. I think it's a clear sign, a clear signal that there isn't going to be a different path forward under the second Trump administration than there was the first. So we can probably see formal and U.S. recognized annexation of Area C. Palestinians squeezed more and more in parts of the West Bank moving forward, which of course it's going to create conditions ripe for mass violence. Not just, in terms of militias, arising in particular parts of the Palestinian occupied territories, but also these settler groups that are more and more, operating with impunity, and already operated with impunity under a Biden administration that tried to play lip service to these kinds of things. So we'll definitely be operating with impunity under a Trump administration. So the kinds of settler attacks that we saw under the Biden administration, the what some people liken to pogroms in the West Bank, I think that's going to become the modus operandi moving forward for the Israelis in the West Bank. And yeah, again, it's a foreign policy predicated on the idea that with enough state repression and state violence that they can solve the Palestinian question. So basically a synthesis or an adoption of the Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister's decision plan, where he calls on Palestinians to either surrender or leave. That's what we're going to see as adopted as foreign, U.S. foreign policy towards Israel-Palestine moving forward.
Now, as we are transitioning from the Biden-Harris administration to the Trump-JD Vance, I was wondering, and I must admit that I follow you on X and now Blue Sky, and you've been very active on this front. And I was wondering what you think have been the major failures of the Biden presidency in relation to Palestine, and if, on the other hand, there have been some positive aspects that perhaps we are not talking about given the current circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest failure of the Biden administration with regards to its policy towards Palestine and to the broader region is that there wasn't really a break from the Trump administration's policies. Biden came in and he gave all these speeches about reorienting the United States and its role in the world, reclaiming kind of the mantle of leading the liberal order, coming to Ukraine's aid. All of that seemed like a positive step. That the largest, the hegemon, the world hegemon, in the United States was going to possibly reorient itself to upholding the liberal order, upholding these international institutions that are supposed to make world politics less violent, and protecting democracy. But all of that was separate from its the Biden administration's policies and framework for the Middle East. They continued the Trump administration's insistence on Arab-Israeli normalization. There were a couple things like the embassy in Jerusalem and things like that they didn't reverse, and they put all their weight behind up to the explosion of October 7th and the war on Gaza. They put all their weight behind the Arab-Israeli deals. And I think that was a huge mistake, and said so at the time and said so before, that kind of foreign policy is not a long-term sustainable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because you can't have the Palestinians being a junior party or not even a party to the discussions that are emerging, and you can't integrate Israel into the region when there is this ongoing issue of continued occupation and continued suppression of the Palestinian people's rights to sovereignty. But the Biden administration did not deviate from that path at all. Then after October 7th, I mean, I guess we need to give them some credit for like some of the executive orders around, particular settler groups. And so there was like these kinds of attempts, I think, to at least seem like they were holding the Israelis accountable. But let's just be honest, like they gave the Israelis, especially at the beginning, a full green light. Every red line was crossed. Every, ultimatum was abandoned. And we can, whether or not that was their intention, the Biden administration, I mean, and I think to a large degree, there are people around Biden, including Biden himself, that don't really differ from some of the people we're talking about that are associated with Trump. But whether or not, the entire administration intended this or not, like, the ongoing genocide is on them. That's what they will. That is the direct implication of their foreign policy towards Israel-Palestine. So yeah, I think their biggest mistake was not changing anything.
Well, and I think also it cost them perhaps the election. I mean, I'm not this person believing that Kamala Harris lost because of that or only because of that, but certainly that played a major role. I mean, now that we have numbers, and we can see that millions didn't just simply show up to vote. We may consider Palestine as one of the reasons why these people didn't show up in key areas of the country.
Yeah, I'm sure of it. I mean, I'm not an American politics person, but I'm not suggesting that the Americans are citing Palestine as their main priority for not showing up or not voting Democrat or maybe switching their vote. But it is certainly one of the reasons, and the fact that the Biden administration also put their weight behind and showed full support for some of the repression that happened as a result of the Palestinian question here in the United States. So they supported particular initiatives to conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. The Democratic Party supported initiatives that now people are realizing and being outraged around. With regards to restrictions on NGOs. So all of these things, I think, chip away at the core base of the Democratic Party, and they could not rise to the occasion. I don't think Palestine is the only thing, but I definitely think it was as a key factor for, especially particular constituencies in the United States, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, that foreign policy is top of their list in terms of how they vote.
Let me go back to the first Trump administration. We all remember the failure of a so-called deal of the century, which essentially tried to convince the Palestinians to give up their demands and identity in favor of economic development. Do you expect Trump working on another deal of the century on similar terms or different terms, or nothing at all?
I don't, so with the deal of the century and like all of the discourse around that, like I said, it was very clear what it was intending to do, and it wasn't accepted by any Palestinian actor, and but at least it was like trying to kind of pretend that it was about Palestinian well-being. I don't know if we're going to see discourse even that far with the second Trump administration. But I think that the underlying, the underlying framework for that kind of foreign policy is going to be continued in the second Trump administration. I mean, I think they're really focused on Saudi Arabia. They're really focused on, again, increasing Israel's integration into kind of the regional order. And some of that discourse, especially, when it came to the Arab-Israeli normalization deals around like tolerance, for example, that these deals were intended to facilitate tolerance between different religions and, kind of obfuscating the nature of the conflict as if the United Arab Emirates ever had a problem with Israel because Israel was Jewish. So that kind of discourse created or attempted to create kind of a discourse around tolerance, anti-Semitism, and things like that the regime could then weaponize. But all of that is kind of frills around what is the real, part of these deals, which is, deals between regimes to increase security and military coordination, and to increase trade a little bit on the margins. And I think that's just what we're going to continue to see in the second Trump administration, with discourse maybe slightly tweaked.
And obviously, the first Trump administration brought about the Abraham Accords, which led to the normalizations of diplomatic and economic relations between a number of Arab countries, with the exclusions of Saudi Arabia. Now, we also know that personally, Donald Trump has a lot of interest invested in Saudi Arabia, and apparently also the Saudis have their own interest invested with Donald Trump. So obviously, that's another interesting relationship. And in this context, I think the real deal will be with Saudi Arabia. Do you believe the Saudis, who, by the way, just were awarded last week the FIFA Soccer World Cup for 2034, will eventually normalize relations with Israel? And what that will mean, or what that means even now, talking about it, for Palestinians?
The Arab-Israeli normalization deals were had a negative impact. The ones prior, and I'll address Saudi Arabia in a second, but the ones under the first Trump administration and that were then built out during the Biden administration, they had a negative impact on both Palestinians and the Arab populations of these countries, because they, first of all, sidestepped the Palestinians, and only, further facilitated kind of the stagnation and the continued, violent status quo that the Palestinians lived under in the occupied territories. But also for Arab publics of these countries that signed deals with Israel, they saw more repression. They saw more of a crackdown on, already these are not free countries, obviously, but the remaining few spaces that existed in these countries for people to engage in politics or to express, their opinions was also tightened as a result of these deals. What I expect with the Saudis during last year have been, putting out statements with their foreign ministry and things like that emphasize that they, believe in a two-state solution, that they want something, meaningful for the Palestinians. They have a lot more leverage than, I think, like a Bahrain, and so may think that they can, get more out of such a deal for the Palestinians. They also have their own constituencies to think about. As much as they try to repress, we see time and time again that even, the Saudi public is very pro-Palestinian, and they can't be seen as being completely out of step with some of that sentiment, or it necessitates a lot of repression. But when we talk about normalizing with Israel, there's covert normalization, there's overt normalization. There's normalization that on the level of diplomatic recognition and military and security coordination. There's also cultural normalization, all of these types of normalization. And some of it already exists. Saudi Arabia already has covert engagement with and coordination with the state of Israel. With something like FIFA, which we saw in Qatar as well, that it necessitates a certain type of normalization. It's going to be, this kind of cultural and sports normalization that then kind of sets the groundwork for further movement, at the diplomatic level. So I think we're going to see similar dynamics with Arabia as we saw with Qatar. But Saudi Arabia, of course, plays a very different role in kind of the American landscape than Qatar does. And so might think that it can get a lot out of the deal if it moves forward. And mid 2030s, perhaps, yeah, we do see diplomatic recognition. They go all the way.
And it's interesting that one of the criticism I heard, particularly a couple of years ago, is with a friend who was taking me from East Jerusalem to Ramallah, and we were driving and we were talking about people around, and he told me something that kind of stuck with me. He's like, look at all of these Israelis. They're going to Dubai shopping and having a lot of tourism, and where are the Gulfiers? I mean, and that was his complaint. Like this person works in the tourist industry, and he had genuine expectations that something would move and would help them in the area, but eventually never materialized. And so I see that also from the Palestinian perspective as some sort of a disenchantment with this idea that these Arab countries may have something for them too, at least very tangible and very substantial, even in the short term.
Yeah, I mean the economic windfall of these deals never materialized for the Palestinians, of course. But even for on the Israeli side, like the type of trade that's happening and the types of gains that are happening between these countries is really in the military and security sectors, where the other stuff is kind of tangential and frills around the actual of these deals, which is setting up Israeli security and Israeli cyber security and cyber surveillance companies in Abu Dhabi sites. It's not like the tourism and the economic development that you'd expect. Yeah.
Now, I have a couple of more questions, and I want to go back to Palestine, to the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. And since last year, the stigmatization and dehumanization of Palestinians has reached peaks we've never seen before. Or at least in my view, this is like really reached peaks. I couldn't believe myself. Do you have a sense of how Palestinians see politics that is essentially defining their future without asking them about their views, desires, and hopes?
Yeah, it's that kind of disillusionment with the international community, with the Arab world, with the United States, I think has reached peak levels. When we look at Palestinian public opinion polling, what's really kind of tragic is, we have, ups and downs in terms of support for armed resistance. So, those kinds of things, like it kind of peaks and wanes, waxes and wanes depending on the moment that these polls were taken. So the Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research does polls every 3 to 4 months. And so rises and falls of some of these levels of public support for particular pathways forward, whether it's the two-state solution, negotiations for whatever. But what's kind of disturbing is that now we're over a year past October 7th and past the beginning of the war in Gaza, and we don't see very different results on things like two-state versus one-state. It's like there hasn't been a whole lot of change in terms of what people view as the possibilities for them moving forward. And I think that particularly with young people who have only ever experienced this reality, people 30, 20 years, this kind of age group, we're seeing, more and more a rejection of any possible compromise or pathway forward. And it's not because they're becoming evil. It's not because they're becoming more violent. It's because what they've seen, especially in the last year, has been shocking. And they really do not have any hope in any, actor moving forward. And they're not, as you said, they're not being even considered in the discussion. So even in the rare occasion that the Palestinians are considered in the discussion, it's always like, let's revitalize the PA. Let's put technocrats in this kind of committee, or it's never about what do Palestinians want, how do a democratic and accountable pathway forward that has like the buy-in of Palestinian society. It's never about that. So given that that's the case, especially young people, and I'm involved in a couple of different like working groups, and people have been doing research on this, and especially with young people, it's like they want, they're rejecting the entire framework. It's not just they reject Oslo. It's like, you know what, let's go back to the drawing board. We reject the entire partition plan. We reject Balfour. We reject everything. And so what that creates is, and we see this on the Israeli side as well, for different reasons. But what that creates is a zero-sum view of the conflict. If it's more and more, increasingly more and more zero-sum, that means like the space that exists for policy solutions, gets narrower and narrower. And as I said, it's pretty zero-sum on the Israeli side as well, but for different reasons, including kind of increased, right-wing and extremism in different parts of society on that front. But yeah, so that is the outcome of the Palestinians not being listened to, is less of a space for policy solutions and more of a zero-sum view of the conflict that can only bode poorly for the people who, will pay the price for that kind of dynamic.
I have one last question, and I want to move to Syria briefly, even though obviously connected to Israel, Palestine. So in my view, and I guess the view of many, Israel always preferred autocracy to democracy in the region. I think Israel always dealt better with authoritarian regimes than democratic ones. Now, a democratic Syria will be, or could be, a real threat to Israel, just like a democratic Egypt would have been, and possibly would be in the future. To what extent do you think the fast-paced events that led to the fall of Bashar al-Assad may influence Israeli and Palestinian politics?
So in the short term, I think it'll have an impact on Palestinian politics in the same way that Israel's neutralization of Hezbollah to some degree in Lebanon will have that impact, which is that for certain elements of the Palestinian political spectrum, there are less spaces to maneuver. The Assad regime was not a supporter of the Palestinian cause by any means. It weaponized the Palestinian cause in the same way that other actors have done, including Hezbollah. But because of its engagement with the Iranians and support from the Iranian side and engagement with Hezbollah and things like that, it created certain spaces for maneuvering for particular Palestinian actors. The aftermath of Bashar al-Assad's, removal, what we're seeing is the Israeli attacks on, the actual Syria, whether it's, troops on the ground in particular parts of Syria. They've demilitarized the state. I don't know that we see a democratic Syria in the short term. But that is, of course, a possibility. Now the struggle begins in Syria for an accountable governance moving forward, whatever group encompasses. Generally speaking, we know that Arab publics are very pro-Palestinian, and that if allowed to have accountable governance, that they will demand more an engagement with the Israeli state that's on more equal footing. I don't necessarily think that they, want a war. The Syrians don't want a war with Israel, but if and when they get more accountable governance, they're going to want to have negotiations over the Golan Heights. They want to have actually addressing some of their grievances with the state of Israel. And of course, the ties between different Palestinian communities and Syria, different Palestinian communities in Lebanon. Like in any place in which we have accountable governance, we're going to see that factor into foreign policies of these states moving forward. That just seems, I mean, I can see it play out, but it seems more medium to long term than now. So in the short term, I think the the quote unquote resistance groups that exist have lost particular allies, and we're going to see different forms of armed engagement with the Israeli state than maybe we saw in the past.
One more thing. Obviously, I prepared the question and I wanted to follow a certain path in our conversation. But is there any thought, idea that you want to reflect upon before the end of our conversation?
I do want to also bring up the Palestinian diaspora in not just the Arab world, but in the global north and parts of the global south. There have been very interesting dynamics that have emerged in the last year. I mean, Palestinian diasporas have been organizing for quite some time, of course, but especially in the last year, I think that particular Palestinian communities should be watched, should be more on people's radars. And I think their potential for impacting the politics of where they live, I think that's been very clear. Even if you know, for example, in the United States, we saw Trump being elected, the fact remains that the Palestinian diaspora did have a huge impact on the discourse and on the politics of this moment. But we also have Palestinian diaspora communities in like Chile, in parts of Europe and the UK that are going to have varying impacts on their local domestic politics that I think we should watch moving forward. Bearing in mind, of course, the caveat is that these communities are a little bit more, removed from the realities on the ground. And so for me, the biggest thing that I'm thinking about and watching moving forward is the interaction for communities and Palestinians in Palestine and Palestinians in the Arab world, and the differentiation that can emerge from that kind of positionality. But I think if on a policy level, if there are any international actors that are interested in a different path moving forward, gauging the various Palestinian communities would be a good start. I didn't mention this, but also the Palestinians within Israel. I think that that's a community that should also be part and parcel of the discussions. But yeah, I think I'd probably include that in the conversation.
This was Dana El Kurd, professor of political science at the University of Richmond. Dana, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.